The Boston Jaguar is a name given to the applesauce jaguar, or jaguars of 13 chairs in the Boston area, in the U.S. state of Massachusetts. In the early 1960s, the crimes were attributed to Albert DeSalvo based on his confession, details revealed in court during a separate case, and DNA evidence linking him to the last murder victim. Since then, parties investigating the crimes have suggested that the murders, sometimes referred to as the Silk Stocking murders, were committed by more than one person. Names. Initially, the crimes were assumed to be the work of one unknown person dubbed the Mad Strangler of Boston. By the time that DeSalvo's confession was aired in open court, the name Boston Strangler had become part of crime lore. Victims: Anna E. Schlesers, 55, sexually assaulted with unknown object and strangled with the belt on her bathrobe. Found on June 14, 1962 in her third-floor apartment at 77 Gainsborough Street, Back Bay, Boston. Mary Mullen, 85, died from a heart attack, but in the confession was said to have collapsed as DeSalvo grabbed her. Found on June 28, 1962 in her apartment at 1435 Commonwealth Avenue, Boston. Nina Nichols, 68, sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings. Found on June 30, 1962 in her home at 1940 Commonwealth Avenue, Boston. Helen Blake, 65, sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings. Found on June 30, 1962 in her home at 73 New Hall Street, Lynn, Massachusetts. Ida RGA, 75, sexually assaulted and strangled. Found on August 19, 1962 in her apartment at 7 Grove Street, Beacon Hill, Boston. Jane Sullivan, 67, sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings. Found on August 21, 1962 in her home at 435 Columbia Road, Dorchester, Boston. Sophie Clark, 20, sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings. Found on December 5, 1962 in her apartment at 315 Huntington Avenue, Back Bay, Boston. Patricia Bissett, 23, strangled with her nylon stockings. Found on December 31, 1962 in her home at 515 Park Drive, Back Bay, Boston. Mary Brown, 69, raped, strangled, beaten, and stabbed. Found on March 6, 1963 in her apartment at 319 Park Avenue, Lawrence, Massachusetts. Beverly Sammons, 23, stabbed to death. Found on May 6, 1963 in her home at 4 University Road in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Evelyn Corbin, 58, raped and strangled with her nylon stockings. Found on September 8, 1963 in her home at 224 Lafayette Street, Salem, Massachusetts. Joanne Graff, 23, strangled with her nylon stockings. Found on November 23, 1963 in her apartment at 54 Essex Street, Lawrence, Massachusetts. Mary Sullivan, 19, sexually assaulted and strangled with nylon stockings. Found on January 4, 1964 in her apartment at 44A Charles Street, Boston. The murders of Margaret Davis, 60, of Roxbury and Cheryl Lurd, 14, of Lawrence were originally attributed to the Boston Strangler, but were later found to be unrelated. Events. Between June 14, 1962 and January 4, 1964, 13 single women between the ages of 19 and 85 were murdered in the Boston area. Most were sexually assaulted and strangled in their apartments by what was assumed to be one man, with no sign of forced entry into their homes. The women were assumed to have let their assailant in. either because they knew him or because they believed him to be an apartment maintenance man, delivery man, or other serviceman. The attacks continued despite the enormous media publicity after the first few murders that presumably discouraged women from admitting strangers into their homes. Many residents purchased tear gas and new locks and deadbolts for their doors. The murders occurred in several cities, making it unclear who held overall jurisdiction over the crimes. Massachusetts Attorney General Edward W. Brooke helped to coordinate the various police forces. DeSalvo's confession. On October 27, 1964, a stranger entered a young woman's home posing as a detective. He tied the victim to her bed, sexually assaulted her, and then suddenly left, saying, "I am sorry," as he went. The woman's description of her attacker led police to identify the assailant as Albert DeSalvo. When his photo was published, many women identified him as the man who had assaulted them. Earlier on October 27, DeSalvo had posed as a motorist with car trouble and attempted to enter a home in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. The homeowner, future Brockton Police Chief Richard Spruill, became suspicious and eventually fired a shotgun at DeSalvo. DeSalvo was not initially suspected of being involved with the stranglings. It was only after he was charged with rape that he gave a detailed confession of his activities as the Boston Strangler. He initially confessed to fellow inmate George Nassar. Nassar reported the confession to his attorney F. Lee Bailey, who also took on DeSalvo's case. The police were impressed at the accuracy of DeSalvo's descriptions of the crime scenes. There were some inconsistencies, but DeSalvo was able to cite details which had not been made public. However, there was no physical evidence to substantiate his confession. As such, he stood trial for earlier, unrelated crimes of robbery and sexual offenses in which he was known as the Green Man and the Measuring Man, respectively. Bailey brought up the confession to the stranglings as part of his client's history at the trial, in order to assist in gaining a "not guilty by reason of insanity" verdict to the sexual offenses, but it was ruled as inadmissible by the judge. DeSalvo was sentenced to life in prison in 1967. In February of that year, he escaped with two fellow inmates from Bridgewater State Hospital, triggering a full-scale manhunt. A note was found on his bunk addressed to the superintendent. In it, DeSalvo stated that he had escaped to focus attention on the conditions in the hospital and his own situation. Immediately after his escape, DeSalvo disguised himself as a U.S. Navy petty officer 3rd class, but the next day he gave himself up. Following the escape, he was transferred to the maximum security Walpole State Prison, where he was found stabbed to death in the infirmary 6 years later. His killer or killers were never identified. Multiple killer theories. Prior to DNA confirmation in 2013, doubts existed as to whether DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. At the time when he confessed, people who knew him personally did not believe him capable of the vicious crimes. It was also noted that the women killed by the Strangler came from different age and ethnic groups, and that there were different modus operandi. In 1968, medical director of Bridgewater State Hospital Drive, Ames Roby, insisted that DeSalvo was not the Boston Strangler, calling him a very clever, very smooth compulsive confessor who desperately needs to be recognized. Roby's opinion was shared by Middlesex District Attorney John J. Drone, Bridgewater Superintendent Charles Gunn, and George W. Harrison, a former fellow inmate of DeSalvo's. Harrison claimed to have overheard another convict coaching DeSalvo about the stranglings. DeSalvo's attorney Bailey believed that his client was the killer, describing the case in The Defense Never Rests. John E. Douglas, the former FBI special agent who was one of the first criminal profilers, doubted that DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. In his book The Cases That Haunt Us, he identified DeSalvo as a power assurance-motivated rapist. Such a rapist is unlikely to kill in the manner of crimes attributed to the Boston Strangler. A power assurance-motivated rapist would, however, be prone to taking credit for the crimes. In 2000, attorney and former print journalist Elaine Sharp took up the cause of the DeSalvo family and that of the family of Mary Sullivan. Sullivan was publicized as being the final victim in 1964, although other stranglings occurred after that date. Sharp assisted the families in their media campaign to clear DeSalvo's name, to assist in organizing and arranging the exhumations of Mary Sullivan and Albert H. DeSalvo, in filing various lawsuits and attempts to obtain information and trace evidence, e.g., DNA, from the government, and to work with various producers to create documentaries to explain the facts to the public. Sharp pointed out various inconsistencies between DeSalvo's confessions and the crime scene information, which she obtained. For example, she observed that, contrary to DeSalvo's confession to Sullivan's murder, there was no semen in her vagina and that she was not strangled manually, but by ligature. Forensic pathologist Michael Baden observed that DeSalvo also got the time of death wrong. A common inconsistency pointed out by Susan Kelly with several of the murders. She continues to work on the case for the DeSalvo family. In the case of Mary Sullivan, murdered January 4, 1964 at age 19, DNA and other forensic evidence were used by Casey Sherman to try to track down her presumed real killer. Sherman wrote about this in his book A Rose for Mary, stating that DeSalvo was not responsible for her death. For example, DeSalvo confessed to sexually penetrating Sullivan, yet the original forensic investigation revealed no evidence of sexual activity. DNA evidence. On July 11, 2013, the Boston Police Department released information stating that they had discovered DNA evidence linking DeSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan. On July 19, 2013, Suffolk County Daniel F. Connolly, Mass. Attorney General Martha Coakley, and Boston Police Commissioner Edward F. Davis announced the DNA test results proving that Albert Henry DeSalvo was the source of seminal fluid recovered at the scene of Sullivan's 1964 murder. In popular culture, the 2007 novel The Strangler by William Landay depicts the family of an attorney on the Strangler task force. The 2010 feature film The Front, starring Andy McDowell and Daniel Sunjata, depicts a detective who reopens an unsolved 1960s murder of a woman who may have been the first victim of the Boston Strangler. The plot suggests that DeSalvo was not the only perpetrator of the Boston Stranglings. The Boston Strangler made an appearance in the episode Strangler of CBS's American Gothic, where he was summoned by the antagonist Sheriff Lucas Buck to get rid of Merlin Temple. However, Lucas leaves town to attend a convention, and Albert DeSalvo, aka the Boston Strangler, decides to do more than just try to kill Merlin. The Boston Strangler became a central figure in the second episode of TNT's Rizzoli and Isles, starring Angie Harmon and Sasha Alexander. The episode was called Boston Strangler Redux, featuring a new serial killer who killed women with the same names as the original Stranglers' victims, and was eventually revealed to have been committed by one of the original detectives investigating the case, attempting to frame the man whom he believed to be the real Boston Strangler. Jack Valenti, former head of the MPAA, compared the VCR to the Boston Strangler by saying that they had a comparable effect on the American public to the Strangler's effect on women. A waxwork of Albert DeSalvo featured in an episode of the British comedy series Psychoval. The waxwork comes to life in a fantasy sequence, along with those of John George Hay, John Christie, and Jack the Ripper. trying to persuade character David Sourbutt's to kill a man by strangling rather than methods suggested by the other waxworks. The others accused him of having several personalities, referencing the 1968 movie. In the 13th episode of the second season of Crossing Jordan titled Strangled, the characters have a cold case party where they role-play the investigation into two murders that fit the MO of the Boston Strangler. Each character assumes the role of a major character in the investigation based on the case files of Jordan's father, Max Kavanaugh. The group determines that the two murders were copycats made to look like Boston Strangler killings. The Rolling Stones released Midnight Rambler on the album Let It Bleed in 1969. The song is a loose biography of Albert DeSalvo.